December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The morning sun glinted off the calm waters of the Pacific as the U.S. Navy's proud battleships lay quietly anchored, a picture of strength and order. USS Arizona, USS Oklahoma, USS West Virginia, names that, at that moment, symbolized American naval might. Sailors moved lazily across the decks, unaware that history was about to turn against everything those ships represented. High above Oahu, the first wave of Japanese aircraft roared through the clouds. Aichi D-3A Vale dive bombers, Nakajima B-5N, Kate torpedo planes, and agile Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters. Their engines screamed as they descended upon the unsuspecting harbor. Below, Seaman First Class James Miller looked up from the deck of the Arizona, hearing what he thought was a routine drill. But the rising sun on the wings was unmistakable. "Those aren't ours," he shouted. The next instant, the sky erupted. Bombs ripped through the still morning air. A torpedo slammed into the West Virginia's hull. The Oklahoma rolled over in minutes, trapping hundreds of men inside. Then came the fatal blow. A bomb pierced the forward magazine of the Arizona. A thunderous explosion split the ship in two. A pillar of fire rose skyward, carrying 1,077 souls with it. From above, Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, leading the attack, watched the chaos unfold and radioed his famous words, "Tora, Tora, Tora, Tora," code for complete surprise. Japan had just dealt the United States one of its greatest naval defeats. But amidst their triumph, Japanese pilots noticed something. The American aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were nowhere in the harbor. They had missed their true targets. To the Japanese High Command, that fact barely mattered. For decades, the battleship had ruled the seas. It was the ultimate weapon, massive, armored, and unstoppable. To them, aircraft carriers were just floating airstrips, fragile, auxiliary vessels to support the real fight. Even as the smoke rose from Pearl Harbor, Japan's admirals celebrated what they believed was the decisive blow of the war. They didn't know it yet, but the age of the battleship had just ended. Section 2, The Carriers Strike Back, April 18, 1942. The early morning quiet was broken by an unfamiliar rumble, the sound of American engines. From the decks of the USS Hornet, 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers had launched into history. Their leader, Lieutenant Colonel James "Jimmy" Doolittle. No one had ever attempted such a mission before. To launch land-based bombers from a carrier, strike the heart of Japan, and then escape towards China. It was reckless, almost suicidal, but it carried a message. America could strike back. As the first bombs fell over Tokyo, Yokohama, and Nagoya, Japanese civilians watched in disbelief. This wasn't supposed to be possible. The Imperial Navy had promised that no enemy would ever reach the home islands. Yet here they were, American bombers roaring over the Emperor's capital. The Doolittle raid caused little physical damage, but psychologically, it was devastating. For the first time, Japan's illusion of invulnerability was shattered. In Tokyo's naval headquarters, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, clenched his fist as reports poured in. He knew what it meant. The Americans had used their carriers to project power thousands of miles from home. And now, the Japanese public was demanding revenge. To restore their honor, Yamamoto devised an operation unlike any before. His plan: lure the remaining U.S. carriers into a trap and annihilate them in one decisive battle. The target, a small, obscure atoll in the middle of the Pacific. Its name was Midway. As the Japanese fleet set sail, 4 massive carriers, dozens of support ships, and the cream of Japan's naval aviators, they believed they were unstoppable. Their pilots, hardened veterans of China and Pearl Harbor, laughed at the idea of American carriers,
standing in their way. They didn't know that the Americans were already waiting. Thanks to cryptographers at Station Hypo in Hawaii, U.S. intelligence had cracked parts of Japan's naval code. Admiral Chester Nimitz knew exactly where Yamamoto would strike, and he planned to meet him head-on. The fate of the Pacific and the future of naval warfare would be decided not by guns or armor, but by the range and reach of carrier-based aircraft.
Section 3. Clash at Midway, June 4th, 1942. Midway Atoll, Central Pacific. The sun was barely above the horizon when the first Japanese aircraft appeared over the coral sands of Midway. Dive bombers screamed down on the island's airfields, unleashing torrents of fire and shrapnel. Buildings burned, fuel tanks exploded, yet even as the defenders fought for their lives, the Japanese Strike Force commander, Lieutenant Tomonaga Joichi, radioed back to his flagship, "Secondary attack required." Far to the north, the carrier Akagi received his message. Admiral Choichi Nagamo frowned. He now faced a deadly dilemma. Should he send a second strike against the island, or prepare for the possibility of an American fleet lurking nearby? His officers argued. The Americans, they insisted, had been crushed at Pearl Harbor. There was no way their carriers could be close. Confident and calm, Nagamo ordered his crews to rearm for a second wave against Midway. It was a fateful decision. While Japanese decks swarmed with ordnance crews, swapping out torpedoes for bombs, U.S. reconnaissance aircraft spotted them. "Enemy fleet sighted," came the message to Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard the USS Enterprise. Instantly, Spruance gave the order, "Launch all planes." Moments later, the decks of the Enterprise and Yorktown erupted into motion. Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers and TBD Devastator torpedo planes roared down the decks and into the sky. Pilots adjusted their goggles and muttered quiet prayers. Among them was Lieutenant Richard Dick Best, leading Bombing Squadron 6. The Americans were outnumbered, outgunned, and flying into chaos. The first waves of torpedo bombers, slow, low, and vulnerable, were slaughtered. Japanese Zeros cut through them mercilessly. Entire squadrons vanished in minutes, their planes plunging into the sea. But their sacrifice wasn't in vain. As the Japanese fighters chased the last of the torpedo planes near sea level, the skies above were left unguarded, and at that precise moment, from 15,000 feet, Dick Best and his Dauntless bombers appeared. Below them, the Japanese carriers were caught with their decks cluttered, bombs, torpedoes, and fuel hoses lying exposed. "Target the Akagi," Best shouted. He dove. Through flak and smoke, his bomb hit squarely on the carrier's flight deck, detonating the armed ordnance below. The Akagi vanished in a cataclysmic fireball. Moments later, two more carriers, Kaga and Soryu, met the same fate under a hail of American bombs. In 5 minutes of hell, Japan lost 3 of its 4 frontline carriers. By the end of the day, the Hiryu, their last surviving carrier, would also be destroyed. 4 carriers gone. Thousands of irreplaceable airmen lost. As the flames consumed the once proud ships, Japanese officers stared in disbelief. The Empire's strongest arm had been severed, not by battleships, but by aircraft launched from floating runways they once mocked as fragile. At Midway, the age of the battleship truly died. Section 4. The Turning Tide, June 5, 1942. The Pacific Ocean, 2,000 miles northwest of Midway. Smoke still hung on the horizon as the remnants of Admiral Yamamoto's proud fleet limped away. On the bridge of his flagship, Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, the Admiral stood silent. Reports from the carriers painted a picture of utter devastation. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, all gone. Hundreds of aircraft lost. Dozens of elite pilots dead. For Yamamoto, the weight of realization sank like an anchor. The weapon that had delivered his triumph at Pearl Harbor, the aircraft carrier, had now become his undoing. Meanwhile, aboard the USS Enterprise, the mood was somber yet resolute. Pilots who had survived the battle returned to decks, scarred by oil, salt, and exhaustion. Commander Wade McCluskey, whose decision to search a little longer had led his bombers to the enemy,
stood by as the last of the damaged Dauntlesses landed. Many never came back. Lieutenant Dick Best, coughing from the effects of cockpit oxygen leaks, watched smoke trails vanish into the sea. "We've turned the tide," someone whispered beside him. But even victory carried the bitter taste of loss. For the first time in the war, the Japanese Navy had been decisively beaten. The myth of their invincibility was shattered. Still, Japan's leaders refused to see the truth. In Tokyo, the Army and Navy High Command censored reports of the defeat. To the public, Midway was portrayed as a strategic withdrawal. Yet inside the Imperial Palace, Yamamoto knew the reality. Japan had lost not just ships, but the initiative. Without their 4 frontline carriers, Japan could no longer go on the offensive. Their pool of veteran pilots, painstakingly trained over years, was gone. And though new ships would be built, their replacements would never match the skill and cohesion of those lost above Midway. Across the ocean, in Washington, D.C., the mood was electric. Admiral Chester Nimitz sent his famous message to his superiors. This was a victory, not of chance, but of preparation, courage, and divine luck. From this point onward, America would seize the initiative. Carrier strike groups, fast, flexible, and deadly, would lead every new offensive. And the giant steel beasts of the past, the battleships once feared and revered, would soon find themselves without a role. The war at sea had changed forever.
Section 5. The Rise of the Floating Airfields. August 1942. The Solomon Islands, South Pacific. The morning fog clung to the ocean like smoke as the USS Enterprise and USS Saratoga launched their aircraft toward a speck of land called Guadalcanal. Below, Marines fought inch by inch to seize a small, unfinished airstrip the Japanese had begun building. Henderson Field. For the first time, American and Japanese carrier forces faced off repeatedly, not in one decisive battle, but in a drawn-out campaign that tested endurance more than firepower. Every pilot, every plane, and every gallon of aviation fuel mattered. The carrier had now become the centerpiece of the Pacific War. Every movement, every invasion, revolved around them. Without carrier air cover, no fleet could survive. Without air superiority, no island could be taken. The Japanese still fielded formidable ships, the new carrier Shokaku, the battleship Yamato, and dozens of cruisers, but they lacked one thing they could never replace: experienced pilots. In contrast, American training schools were producing new aviators by the hundreds. Men like Lieutenant Commander John Jimmy Thatch and Ensign George Gay, survivors of early defeats, became instructors, passing on hard-earned lessons of dogfighting and carrier operations. In every battle that followed, the Eastern Solomons, Santa Cruz, the Bismarck Sea, carrier groups learned, adapted, and improved. Coordination between ships, aircraft, and intelligence grew tighter. Carrier task forces became moving fortresses, supported by radar-guided defenses and relentless patrols. The Japanese, meanwhile, clung to the old doctrine, the idea of the decisive battle, where massive ships would line up and destroy the enemy in a single strike. But that world was gone. The carrier changed everything. No longer did fleets need to see each other to fight. Battles were decided hundreds of miles apart by the skill of pilots and the precision of deck crews, loading bombs under the tropical sun. The roar of engines replaced the thunder of naval guns. Even Japan's most feared weapon, the battleship Yamato, would spend most of the war anchored, unused. Its massive 18-inch guns, the largest ever mounted on a ship, were now relics of a bygone age. As one American officer would later write, the aircraft carrier didn't just replace the battleship, it buried it. Yet the final, decisive proof of that truth was still to come. In 1944, when the Pacific would witness the largest naval battle in history. Section 6. The Day of the Great Marianas, Turkey Shoot, June 19, 1944.
The Philippine Sea. The morning sky was clear, perfect flying weather. Across a vast stretch of blue water, 9 American aircraft carriers formed the core of Task Force. Their decks were alive with movement. Hundreds of F-6F Hellcats, SB-2C Helldivers, and TBF Avengers roared into the air in disciplined waves. On the horizon, a massive Japanese armada steamed eastward. Admiral Jesaburo Ozawa commanded 9 carriers, including the Taiho and Shokaku, determined to halt the U.S. advance toward the Mariana Islands. The Japanese believed they still had the air. Their new Zero fighters were upgraded, their pilots ready to prove the Emperor's fleet still ruled the skies. But what Ozawa didn't realize was that Japan's once elite airmen were gone. Most of the men now flying from his carriers were barely trained. Many had never even practiced carrier landings before this mission. As radar screens aboard the USS Lexington lit up with incoming blips, Admiral Mark Mitcher calmly ordered, "Turn into the wind. Launch everything." At 10, the first Japanese strike wave approached, over 200 aircraft, but the Americans were waiting. Their radar-guided combat air patrols vectored dozens of Hellcats straight toward the enemy. What followed was slaughter. Commander David McCampbell, one of the Navy's top aces, led his squadron into the formation. "We tore them apart," he would later say. The sky became a fiery graveyard of burning Zeros and broken wings. Pilots called it a turkey shoot, a grim nickname for a lopsided battle. By day's end, over 350 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed. The Americans lost fewer than 30. Worse still for Japan, the carrier Taiho, Ozawa's new flagship, was struck by a single American torpedo. Poor damage control and gasoline vapors turned it into a floating inferno. Hours later, it exploded, taking hundreds of men with it. The Shokaku, veteran of Pearl Harbor, met the same fate. From his command post, Ozawa watched smoke rise from the horizon and realized the horrifying truth. Japan no longer had an air force at sea. His surviving ships fled west, their flight decks empty. In Washington, the victory was met with jubilation, but in the Pacific, it carried deeper meaning. The U.S. Navy had achieved total air dominance. Never again would Japan's carriers threaten the sea lane, and the battle had proven beyond any doubt. The aircraft carrier was now the most powerful weapon on Earth. Yet, even as Japan's carrier fleet burned, Yamato, the symbol of old naval glory, still waited for one final, tragic mission.
Section 7. The Last Voyage of the Yamato. April 7th, 1945. East China Sea. The sea was rough and grey as the giant battleship Yamato surged through the waves, her 72,000 tons of steel slicing toward Okinawa. She was the largest, most powerful battleship ever built, armed with 9 18-inch guns, capable of hurling shells the size of small cars over 25 miles. To many in Japan, she was more than a ship. She was a symbol, the embodiment of the empire's might and spirit. But as she steamed toward her destiny, her mission was nothing short of suicidal. With fuel for only a one-way trip, Yamato and her small escort were ordered to beach themselves at Okinawa and fight as stationary gun platforms to repel the American invasion. Her crew of over 3,000 men knew what that meant. Few expected to return home. Meanwhile, above the Pacific, American codebreakers had already intercepted Japan's orders. The U.S. Navy was ready. Before Yamato ever came within sight of Okinawa, she was spotted by U.S. reconnaissance aircraft. Within hours, over 380 carrier-based planes, Avengers, Helldivers and Corsairs, were launched from Task Force 58. The same carriers that had once been dismissed as support ships were now Japan's executioners. The first wave of American planes dove from the clouds. Bombs and torpedoes struck Yamato's decks with thunderous force. Her gunners,
manning dozens of anti-aircraft batteries, fired desperately, filling the sky with black flak bursts. Pilots described it as flying through a storm of steel, but the carrier planes kept coming, wave after wave. Torpedoes tore into her hull, one after another. She began to list to port, her massive guns unable to track the swift aircraft above. Inside, hundreds of sailors drowned as compartments flooded. At 2:23 p.m., a massive internal explosion ripped through her magazines. The shockwave shattered glass on aircraft flying miles away. A towering column of flame, smoke and debris rose more than 3 miles into the air. When the smoke cleared, Yamato was gone. Over 3,000 Japanese sailors perished, more than the number lost at Pearl Harbor. Only 69 survivors were pulled from the sea. For Japan, the destruction of the Yamato wasn't just the loss of a ship. It was the death of an era. The battleship, once the supreme ruler of the oceans, had been annihilated without ever firing a single shell at her enemy. The weapon Japan had mocked, the aircraft carrier, had now erased her most powerful symbol. Section 8. The Dawn of Carrier Supremacy. August 15, 1945, Tokyo Bay. The war was over. Japan's once mighty empire lay in ruins. Its cities burned, its fleet shattered, its skies empty. On the decks of the USS Missouri, Allied officers assembled beneath a gray, heavy sky as General Douglas MacArthur stood before Japanese envoys. Carrier-based aircraft circled overhead in silent formation, the final unmistakable symbol of who now ruled the seas. It had taken less than 4 years for naval warfare to be utterly transformed. In 1941, the world's admirals believed in battleships, towering fortresses of armor and firepower. By 1945, it was clear the future belonged to the aircraft carrier. Throughout the closing months of the war, these floating airfields became the backbone of America's power projection. From Iwo Jima to Okinawa, carriers provided round-the-clock air support, bombarding enemy positions, escorting bombers, and shielding fleets from kamikaze attacks. Even as Japan unleashed waves of suicide planes, desperate pilots diving their aircraft into American decks, the carrier groups adapted. Damage control teams moved with practiced precision. Within hours of being hit, most carriers were operational again. The flexibility, resilience, and striking power of these ships were unlike anything the world had ever seen. In the span of one conflict, the aircraft carrier had evolved from an experimental concept to the commanding center of global warfare. Japan, which had once mocked the idea, had paid the ultimate price for its underestimation. The lessons learned in blood over Pearl Harbor, Midway, and Okinawa would shape navies for generations to come. Standing on the Missouri's deck that day, Admiral Chester Nimitz quietly reflected on how far things had come. He had seen the old ways die, and the new born in fire. The Pacific, once dominated by steel giants, was now ruled by flight decks and propellers overhead. Hundreds of carrier aircraft roared in a thunderous salute, an aerial symphony marking not just victory, but transformation. In the decades that followed, every great naval power would follow America's lead. The British, the French, the Soviets, and even the Japanese would rebuild their fleets around carriers. The battleship became a relic, a museum piece. The aircraft carrier had become the true capital ship of the modern age. From the ashes of Pearl Harbor to the flight decks of Tokyo Bay, the truth was undeniable. Air power had conquered the sea, and the men who once laughed at the floating airfields lived just long enough to realize they had changed the world forever.